The reason that a food forest system isn't going to need herbicides as a specific chemical intervention is because the role that herbicides play in propping up a system is going to be filled by the food forest ecosystem. So I'm pretty cold, my face is frozen, so my speech is going to be a little frozen. I might sound drunk, but it's just because my face is frozen. This video is going to be about why food forests don't need herbicides, how the system of a forest ecosystem, and specifically in a food forest, a built forest ecosystem with food-containing plants, how that takes care of the ecological needs that typically are not taken care of, and therefore herbicides are needed as a chemical intervention to prop up the system. So my name is Nick. If you go check me out, I build food forests for people. So this is what I do. I install and design food forest garden systems for people. So if you go to Eternal.Harvest on Instagram, you can send me a message if you want me to design or build you a food forest. But essentially, the reason that we're not going to be using herbicides in a food forest is because what are herbicides there to do? They're there to kill plants. And a lot of the time, the plants that an herbicide are going to kill are weeds. And so what are weeds? When you think about it in an ecosystem, in a forest ecosystem, like what we've got over here, weeds aren't exactly an issue. Why is it that in a natural forest ecosystem, you can hear the frozen, I can't go, that is too fast for my frozen face. Why is it that in a forest we don't need herbicides, that weeds are not a problem? Well, there's a variety of reasons, and essentially some of them are very simple, like the fact that there's shade, that there's a thick mulch of leaves on the ground that prevent weeds from growing, that there is a canopy, an understory, an herbaceous layer, that the whole system, every layer of the ecosystem is already filled, and so there's not much of a spot for weeds to come in. But you can also think of this in terms of the soil. So what are weeds ecologically? In a wild system, weeds actually have a perfectly valid role. The only reason we call them weeds is because we design these artificial systems, say a monoculture cornfield, and then when a plant comes in and doesn't work with the artificial system, we call it a weed. So a weed really isn't a weed. Really, a weed is just a fast-growing plant that happens to do well in disturbed, low-nutrient soil. So say in the wild, you have an earthquake, you have a tornado, you have a wildfire. In that kind of system, you're going to have a disturbed soil, a bare spot, and weeds are going to come in. When we go and till a field so that we can go and plant a bunch of corn, weeds are going to come in. And the reason for that is because the soil is disturbed. Essentially, when you're tilling, you're combining an earthquake, a tornado, and a tsunami, all that stuff at once. You're just putting everything in a blender. So what would the role of weeds be in a wild system? The role of weeds would be to grow fast, producing lots of organic matter, to produce lots of nutrients, and essentially to quickly take a disturbed soil and get plants growing so that when it rains, the soil does not flatten into a hard pan, so that the soil has organic matter and can absorb water. Essentially, when there's really disturbed soil, weeds are going to come in and cover up the soil, protect the soil, increase the organic matter in the soil, increase the soil ecology, get nutrients cycling in the soil. So when you think of it like this way, let's say we actually had a old industrial agricultural field that's been growing corn for 20 years. The organic matter is at 1%. It's low in nutrients. There's no organic matter. There's no soil ecology. The soil is destroyed. Actually, the best thing we could do, not the best thing, but let's say we just leave that cornfield to go and turn to weeds. What we're doing there is actually letting nature recover the soil. Now, it might take actually like 50 years for those weeds to produce into shrubs, to go into forest, especially depending on the surrounding area. If there's not a lot of surrounding forest to move in through birds bringing seeds in, squirrels bringing seeds in, whatever the method may be, just trees growing in, dropping their seeds. Whatever kind of situation is going on there, it's going to be slow, but if you just let weeds take over, that's actually going to improve the soil, improve the ecosystem. Now, we can utilize this actually if we're regenerating land. And the way we would do that is by cover cropping. Essentially what cover cropping is that we're taking a weed plant, an ecologically weed plant that grows fast, builds up nutrients. We're putting it in, we're letting it grow, and we're killing it before it can produce seeds. So naturally, it would take a while for the entire ecosystem to change, for the weeds to eventually fill their job and leave. When we're building a system, we don't want a bunch of weed seeds there. Even if the ecology is all on point, if you have hundreds of thousands of seeds of a certain weed, that's going to mess with your system. So, kind of bringing this back to a food forest context. In a food forest, what we're often doing is, like I said, taking a disturbed soil, maybe an old piece of farmland, maybe just grass lawn. Now, you can take a normal forest and integrate food forest systems into it, but I prefer to build a food forest where we can regenerate soil that's previously been destroyed. That's how we're going to have the biggest impact on the environment. It kind of doesn't make sense to take a beautiful wild forest ecosystem, knock a bunch of trees down, and build in a food forest. That's going to have a mild negative effect on the environment. Whereas if you build a food forest on a lawn, you're going to have a super positive effect. And on an old industrial agricultural field, you're going to have a super positive effect on the environment. So, kind of bringing these ideas together now. We understand what weeds are in an ecosystem. We understand how to harness weeds in a food forest system. You can cover crop for a year or two on really poor soil. That is a valid, commonly used option, especially when you're thinking about some kind of really long-term project. You totally can harness the power of weeds to do that. So weeds have a certain role. When you get past that disturbed soil, when there is not tilling, soil just being, moved up, whether it's by shoveling, by plowing, by just whatever method there is, when the soil is not being disturbed, when there is a layer of mulch like you would see on a forest floor, when there is already other plants growing. And here's a big thing. So weeds grow in, and now we're kind of just wrapping this up, but just a little bit more to understand what is next, what's past the weeds, right? So when we're designing these food forest systems, the soil itself is not going to support weeds. And the reason for that is that weeds come in on nutrient depraved, disturbed soil. They build a very bacterially dominated soil. That is because weeds often have green leaves. They're not woody. Now, as you move into more woody weeds and more bush type plants, you're going to create a more fungal soil. And so basically let's say we have disturbed soil. The next layer of plants that are growing weeds are going to create a more bacterial dominated soil. It's a level up. That more bacterial dominated soil is going to allow some more complex plants to grow that are a bit more woody. That's going to create a bit more of a fungal soil. That more fungal soil is going to allow more woody plants until eventually we have a very fungal soil that supports a forest ecosystem. Now, this is called ecological succession. So every plant has a role in ecological succession that is maturing an ecosystem and developing healthier soil. Healthier or just more complex. In a wild ecosystem, there are going to be areas that are disturbed. That's a normal part of ecological development. Wildfires, earthquakes, tornadoes, all these things ecosystems are adapted to. They need a reset every once in a while. But ideally, in a wild forest, you would see at least 80% of the system be in that more mature stage. Now, I could get into ecology here. I'll just say one more thing and then we'll kind of wrap this up. In ecology, we used to think that a mature ecosystem was the pinnacle. Now we have more of a dynamic mosaic model where, like I said, some areas are disturbed. So when you think about building up a food forest, you're going to build up a soil that is very fungal dominant, that is very ecologically active. That soil itself is just not going to grow weeds well. So one of the best ways to handle weeds in a food forest is to just have a good soil, so the soil does not support weeds. The plants that are growing do not allow weeds to come in. The lack of disturbance in soil health does not allow weeds to come in. So that's essentially it. We have a very fungal soil. And so when you're building a food forest, what do? You put down a layer of, and this is how I do it. You put down a layer of cardboard or cardboard paper, ideally without any dyes, all natural plant material, to kill whatever weeds are there, to allow them to sprout and die. We're not just mixing up the soil and bringing weed seeds to the surface. All the weed seeds that are on the surface will grow and die. We put down like 6 inches of wood chips to further kill those weeds. So we're just killing the weeds that are there. Like I said, yeah, you want to support a system that ecologically doesn't support weeds, but you also just don't want to have 10,000 weed seeds growing there. If you have some very difficult plants, some crabgrass, some whatever plant isn't going to get killed by that, it might make sense to use plastic occultation for a season. Now, this isn't ideal, but when we're working with these systems, sometimes you just got to do something like that. Are there other ways to do it? You could outcompete it with a cover crop. Yeah, technically there's other ways to do it. I'm all for doing it the most natural way as possible, but in my experience, this is the best I know how to do. And really, you'll find that it is just so effective that it's worth using a bit of plastic. You can reuse the plastic. So the system doesn't support weeds. We're getting rid of weeds ahead of time. Now, why would we need to use herbicides? And yeah, for example, you could use herbicides to kill the weeds that are there to establish a food forest. I'd much rather put down a piece of plastic for a bit than spray these toxic chemicals. So it's much better than herbicides. That's what allows us to do this one-time temporary intervention that gets rid of the weeds that are there, so we never have to use herbicides ever. Now, in organic farming, we're often not going to be using herbicides. This is some of the later videos in this series, this little mini series. We're going to talk about other chemicals where even in organic farming, we're using pesticide interventions that are organic, so to speak. In this example, this is really in contrast to industrial agriculture. In industrial agriculture, like I said, we're constantly disturbing the soil. The soil is of low quality, super low nutrients, super disturbed. We're bringing up weed seeds. It's just the perfect... think about it, you're blending up the soil, any weed seeds, and it's just so you know, weed seeds stay dormant for a very long time in the soil. They're being brought to the surface, and then after they're brought to the surface, they're in a very disturbed soil, so of course they're going to grow. So that's why in industrial agriculture, we're essentially dependent on herbicides. Even the plants that are growing there very rapidly can't outcompete them. So in comparison to industrial agriculture, in a food forest, we're on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum where the soil is at a very high stage of ecological succession. It's very mature. And so weeds really aren't much of an issue in a food forest. This is nice because they're very low maintenance. And yeah, in organic gardening, we're not typically going to be using herbicides, but there's a lot of maintenance. People spend a lot of time weeding their gardens. In a food forest, once it's really developed, after a couple years of installation, maturation, a food forest can go with very, very little weeding, maybe a couple hours a year, if that even. So that's the video. Next video is going to be about another chemical. I'll probably do pesticides next. Peace. Like I said, message me at Eternal Period Harvest on Instagram if you want me to design or build you a food forest.